Maya pabengi kay kawangan, diri nanda kayo maya pa yato. That's good evening and good greetings from my native tongue, which is Kapampangan. Thank you so much for the invitation for me to join you tonight. Mike is a really dear friend and I'll never forget that moment. He mentioned it in passing during a Word and World session where his intervention really empowered me as a person of color. And I will always remember you for that time. Thank you so much. Yeah, and Kateri, his daughter, is someone that Jim and I, my husband and I, are enjoying having here in Detroit. So next, can you have the PowerPoint? Yeah, and slide 2, please. So Mike has already walked us through all the acknowledgements, but just to reiterate once more, I wanted us to take a moment to honor and express gratitude to our ancestors, my ancestors, your ancestors, and to all our other more than human ancestors who have been here far longer than us and have been keeping life alive on this planet for millennia. We give our thanks to them. And I also want us to honor the homelands that we come from, to honor and recognize those whose lands we're on. In my particular case, this place, Wawiyatanong, where the river bends, also known as Detroit, Michigan, where my partner and I currently reside, is home to the Anishinaabe peoples, Wyandot Huron, Fox, Miami, and Saw. I also want to honor my home province in the Philippines, which is the traditional homeland of the Aita peoples. And we want to honor each other and our presence in this virtual space at this particular moment. We're grateful for life and breath and for relative good health that we're able to come together tonight and learn together. Next slide, please. So a little personal introduction, which is really a whole life's journey that's back behind what I'm about to share with you today. I was born and raised in the Philippines, one of 6 children, 1 boy and 5 girls, second to the youngest. A pastor's kid, had a born-again experience in college through InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. So Christianity loomed large in my social and spiritual upbringing. As such, for much of the early half of my life, I had no sense of belonging other than that of the church community and the campus Christian fellowship that I was part of. I was a Filipina only by geographic accident, my primary identification being that of a child of God. But despite the teaching of God's unconditional love, I never really experienced a sense of wholeness. For as long as I could remember, I've always struggled with a mysterious malaise that kept me from feeling whole inside. This is in spite of being a recognized spiritual mentor to many. There's a phrase in Tagalog for it, tinimbang ka ngunit kulang. You were weighed and found wanting, a sense of not measuring up that kept me from feeling at home in myself. Next slide. Next slide, yeah. I didn't know at the time about the colonized condition, that this is what it does to a people. It throws them out of sync with themselves, so they no longer know how to be. Something that within the individualizing mode of Protestantism often got translated into personal failure, a lack of faith, or plain sinfulness. We were forced to speak English. We were punished 5 centavos apiece for every infraction, which was traumatizing for me. Our textbooks were written by American authors. from the perspective of the US colonizers who claimed to know us better than we knew ourselves. And for those of you who know little about the history between the US and the Philippines, we were brutally invaded at the turn of the 20th century by the US Army, all 70,000 troops, massacring 1/6, more than 1 million of the country's population at the time. The US takeover of the Philippines was in fact what catapulted it to the status of a superpower. It claimed to do so in the name of God, duty-bound to civilize a senile and savage people who were deemed incapable of governing themselves. Part of that civilizing mission was to convert us into dutiful Christians. Our earth-based spiritual traditions effectively cast as mere superstition, if not downright demonic or idolatrous. Next slide. In school, all the instruments of knowing normalized Western culture and Western modes of being as the only way to be human and pathologized everything native. Hence, you had to become efficient, productive. We were called lazy, and the purported indolence of the Filipino people was endlessly remarked on. They had to become acquisitive, not easily content, ever advancing. We had to be committed to progress, to leaving the past behind, and being future-oriented. Individualistic, the pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. And you had to be driven and ambitious.
Lily. Lily, something's happening with the audio. We're not able to hear you. Is that just me, or can everyone? Okay.
Yeah.
No, it's not just you.
Oh, there you are, Lily.
Yeah. And most of all, you had to be English speaking. Next slide, please.
So just so you know, we lost maybe the last 2 minutes. We didn't hear what you said. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just saying that you had to be driven, ambitious, and rational, mistrustful, feeling, intuition, and bodily ways of knowing. Next slide. My own cultural awakening came unexpectedly in a class in the humanities at the University of the Philippines titled The Image of the Filipino in the Arts, taught by an ethnomusicology professor who conducted firsthand research into our land-based communities that were the farthest away from the reach of missionization and urbanization. It's an experience I'll never forget. One I invariably speak about as opening up to me a whole counter-colonial archive that would call into question all I've ever been taught about who we were as a people. From the complex geometric weaving designs, the native instruments that not only sounded but looked utterly beautiful, to the intricate architectural structures that didn't use a single nail to bind parts together, etc. And all of these creations of beauty, ritually sourced, many given in dreams, with materials taken from the wild, only with the requisite honoring and asking for permission, and always in service of beauty. I fell in love. These are people called primitive and backward by the Christian missionaries and American educators and civilizers, and yet they were ones who have actually known how to live in place without needing to egress on others or without decimating their land bases, having a full spectrum of different ways of knowing and knowing how to make beauty that, as our indigenous teacher likes to say, could cause everything to jump up and live again. It is this that finally brought healing to my soul. one I experienced as a kind of homecoming. Here at last was a people I could finally identify with and belong to. It was like having another mirror held up to me, reflecting myself back to me and telling me, these are your people. You belong to a beautiful people. And it is this that began my journey to decolonization, primarily through my introduction to the indigenous world of our native peoples. Next slide, please. So I'm sure this is not the first time you're hearing this word, decolonization, which I understand as the process of unlearning colonial and imperial ways of being and thinking. But it's not just this. As scholars Tuck and Young wrote in an essay titled, Decolonization is not a metaphor. Ultimately, decolonization is about land and the return of land to those from whom it's been stolen. But in this particular focus for tonight, we will be looking at how, as a result of the history of colonialism, for those of us who have been assimilated into its various systems of domination, what we're having to do is to unlearn our appropriative and imperial stance towards the world. The notion that the earth and everything in it was made for us, that we are it, the center of the world. And in order to do that, we need to see decolonization as a creative, psycho-spiritual, moral, and activist endeavor. We also want to turn our gaze toward the center, what we call the West, to understand that what has now been globalized as the premier way to live is just one cultural formation, and one that's actually decimating the planet at that. We turn our gaze toward the center because typically when things aren't working well, our tendency is to focus on the experiences of the others, and we ask what's wrong with them. In fact, most of the studies on unlearning colonial thinking, racism, healing post-colonial trauma, etc., have always focused on the experiences of others, those often at the receiving end of the violence. What happens when we turn our gaze toward the center and take a look at how this particular center enacts its imperial gaze, enacts its appropriative stance toward the rest of the world? Next slide, please. So here's our assumption. There's no unlearning of colonial imperial thinking without some other ground on which to stand on. And for me, that other ground is that whole body of wisdom that our ancient ancestors knew about, what it means to live in a good way, to live intimately and in reciprocity with all beings of the land that nurture them. Next slide. And another assumption is this: all humans have a 2 million-year-old person inside, and if we lose contact with that part of us, we lose our real roots, from Carl Jung. So the Haudenosaunee have a concept called the long body. We'll talk about it some more later on. So next slide. A few notes on the indigenous soul from a native teacher that my hubby, Jim, and I have been studying with for about 10 years now. His name is Martin Pertel. He says, every individual in the world, regardless of cultural background or race, has an indigenous soul struggling to survive in an increasingly hostile environment created by that individual's mind. Over the last several centuries, a heartless, culture-crushing mentality has enforced its so-called progress on the earth, devouring all peoples, nature, imagination, and spiritual knowledge. Like a bulldozer, it has left a flat, homogenized streak of civilization in its wake. Every human on this earth, whether from Africa, Asia, Europe, or the Americas, has ancestors whose stories, rituals, ingenuity, language, and life ways were taken away, enslaved, banned, exploited, twisted, or destroyed by this mentality. What is indigenous? In other words, natural, subtle, hard to explain, generous, gradual, and village-oriented in each of us has been banished to the ghettos of our heart or hidden away from view on reservations inside the spiritual landscape. We're taught to believe that our thoughts are actually the center of our life. Like the conquering modern culture we belong to, we understand the world only with the mind, not with the indigenous soul. Next slide, please. Next slide, yeah. So part of our inheritance is this big indigenous soul that is connected to ancestry, to place, to nature, to community, history, to gender, dreams, and sense of the sacred, to mythic stories. So if an indigenous person comes up to you and asks you, who are you? They're not asking about your career, what you do in your job, where you live, etc. They're asking for the story of your long body, which includes all of these relationships, all these aspects of indigenosity that makes up who you are. Next slide. How have we become severed from this connection? How did we lose our big indigenous self and became reduced into what one theorist called a homo clausus, a closed-off individual? One requirement to become a modern human being is precisely to get rid of our quote-unquote cultural baggage. A term they use in psychology is normative dissociation, here defined as the disconnection and splitting off of individuals from the Earth's cycle of nurturing and being nurtured as a social norm. Also, a cultural process that changes indigenous selves into atomized, individualistic, well-boundaried selves. In other words, our disconnection as modern humans comes from being told we are sovereign and masterful, a notion that feeds our sense of self. We're trained by the dominant culture to adopt a distancing and objectifying gaze towards the world, the appropriative lens we mentioned earlier, where we judge the value of things based on their utility to us as humans. In the process, we lost the capacity for reverential relationships with others, with the earth and all her beings. Maurice Berman, a writer, says that the culture that has emerged in the United States is a hustling culture, one that is about the game of getting over, of one-upmanship that keeps us from being able to have intimacy, not only with other human beings, but with the rest of the more than human world. There's actually a poignant story that you can check out on YouTube by British mythologist Martin Shaw. It's called The Hunter and the Fox Woman, that talks precisely about this predicament of modern humans. Next slide, please. What we need then is to recover a more expansive sense of self, to relearn indigenous ways of being as a way of healing the trauma brought on by our disconnection, to have a different quality of presence in the world. If we are to be strict about the use of the term indigenous, there are only 350 million remaining indigenous peoples in the world out of a total global population of 7.5 billion, who either are still living on their homelands or that retain memory and insist on living according to their land-based traditions as encoded in their ecologically grounded cultural practices. I wouldn't call myself indigenous, but someone seeking to recover a sense of indigeneity. And much of what I know comes from my tutelage to the indigenous elders in my homeland, from learning to pay attention to the wild beings that are still around, even in the city where I live, from reading indigenous literature, having relationships with indigenous people, both in my homeland and
Jeopardy aired its very first episode. Art Fleming was the host, and the payment for the first champion, $345. And it's a far cry from the $54,800 Jackie Kelly pulled in for her.
Yes, whoever's listening to Jeopardy, if you could mute yourself.
But the basic questions remains the same.
Everybody,
So
please
let's
mute.
play Jeopardy. Welcome Candace and Joey. Here are the categories in the first round of play.
All right, I think we are set. Well, while we're here, Lily, could we pause just for a moment for if there are any questions or if anyone. Feel free to use the chat, folks, but if anybody wants to ask any or clarify anything before we move on.
Yeah, and if you can monitor the chat, Mike.
Yes, I certainly will.
Okay. Thank you.
All
Yeah,
right.
I have a thought about the use of indigenous, the term indigenous.
Yeah,
in
it's a very embattled term, and we don't have to use it, but somehow we need to find a way to talk about a particular lifestyle, a particular way of living that is, I would call it land taught. You know, a lot of this, what we now understand as indigenous cultures, they derive the forms and patterns of their ways of being from living in a particular given local ecology. And that is what shapes the worldview understandings. So for us, I would say that if we're not living on the land, where we're living by industrial civilization, then much of our way of life are detached from those land-based ways of living. And so it is in reference to that I use the term indigenous, and we can, and later on when we go further, we will understand that for 95% or 99% of our time on the planet, we lived indigenously, right? You have civilization going with domestication and monocrop, settled monocrop agriculture and city building. You get that rolling only about 5,000 years ago, which compared to anywhere from hundreds of thousands to 2 to 3 million years, depending on what you consider as a human being, we live very differently than we live now.
Right. I think what I was going to say, though, was more to being careful about when folks are talking about indigenous people, particularly when someone says we and our and us.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, who is we and who is our and
Yes.
who is us?
Yes.
I consider myself an indigenous person. I'm an African American, or I'm Black.
Mhm.
My ancestors did not arrive here willingly.
Mhm.
They were abducted.
Mhm.
If I could go back to try to reclaim some of my ancestors' native lands, I would not be able to do that because I don't have that claim, not knowing
Mhm.
where my land or the land that they come from. But because I don't know where that land is, because I am not able to touch it, I feel that that does not somehow take away
Mhm.
my person as being indigenous.
Yeah.
And so I think that when there is that conversation, of course, what has happened globally has affected different people's different cultures variously. And so I just want to be very, very careful about how that's understood. There are a number of things when you see colonization, you recognize it, you know what it looks like. But I think the impact looks somewhat different depending upon what specific history it is that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And so I want to be very clear about that. Now, I'm sure that there are some people that would argue against that, and that's fine. I'm always open for debate.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to put that out there to be very, very clear about that's another area that, oh, maybe we need to think about that as well.
Yeah, exactly. And with climate change today, and I think the investment in trying to relearn those ancestral ways of being that are taught by the land is because we're now up against what some say is the sixth great mass extinction, which is already underway. And so those of us who have been separated, like for myself, I have been not just by colonization, but my modern schooling also. That's what I was talking about in my personal introduction, has distanced me. Modern schooling and modernity as a worldview and as a cultural formation, it's what it does to people, which is to disparage land-based living and to see those as no better than living like animals, right? The notion of civilized versus primitive, and that way of thinking about people who are still land-based is really what is destructive, And so even if I'm living in the city, there's no excuse for me not to try to learn how to live in a good way again by recovering those relationships.
Right.
Okay, thank you. So can we proceed?
Thanks so much, Courtney.
Thank you. Yeah.
There was a question in the chat that said, from Alex, I'm seeing lots of references to rewilding. Can you say more about what that means, or how wilding or rewilding is about centering our way of life in the earth and local ecosystems? Maybe that's something you'll get to later in.
Yeah, I think, I think the instinct to rewild is right on, except that sometimes there is a claim to be reinventing the wheel. For me, the reason why I turn to my indigenous ancestors is because before we had this rewilding movement by a lot of usually white folks, right? We already have, and we still have, people who are still living in a good way, right? In a land-taught way. And so for me, I would say that I would probably ask, okay, you're rewilding on your own. Do you have any relationship with the native peoples in the land where you're doing this, right? What is the history? And that's part of the framework that I'm trying to put together here. So if I can proceed.
Sure, thank you.
So even learning from the writings of indigenous writers and teachers, right? My learning then still has to become embodied in relationship to the place where I live, which is Black Bottom. It's called Black Bottom here in Detroit. To learn its history of native dispossession and the subsequent displacement of a thriving African-American community through gentrification. And underneath all that, the ecocide, the clearing of the land to build an industrial city. Michigan is known to have been 95% forested prior to settlement and development. And what that might mean in terms of my responsibility to those communities that have been displaced, both human and the more than human. So next slide, please. And what this indigenous recovery offers is a different kind of hope. It's not mastery, but a hope that stems from the potential that we humans can remember and work with ancient capacities built into each of us. Next slide. And the goal is of transformation, is reconnection with the ground of our being. There's no healing of self without the healing of the whole. We cannot heal in isolation. Next slide. So we have this summary diagram. At the heart of this process is a storytelling self. Stories can be medicine, but they have to be told in a good way, not leaving anything out, the good, the bad, and the ugly. You know, modernity, you can think of it as a narrative, as a story, the story of what it means to be a human being. So we're trying to say here is that we need a new story of the self. It's not about exorcism, but about metabolizing, composting, integrating, and it entails a lot of what we call shadow work. And I know, Mike, this is your field, right? Psychology. Next slide, please. In a sense, we can think of colonial thinking, white supremacy, and all forms of domination as compensatory mechanisms for all the losses. Because without all these connections that makes you into a vibrant, secure, and interesting human being, you don't really know who you are. So you try to find alternative satisfaction by saying, I'm better than you. So if we say that land-taught peoples, for example, cannot talk about who they are without their connection to the land, without their connection to the particular places where they live, right? Our disconnection, on the other hand, makes us think of ourselves as individuals, and our socialization into modernity severs our consciousness or awareness of our embeddedness into all these relationships, although in reality we're really utterly dependent on the land, right? On the beings in the land. Even if we think our food comes from the grocery store, ultimately we're still utterly dependent on the earth. Next slide, please. So here's our assumption. Once upon a time, you and I all had ancestors who knew how to live on the land, who understood the language of the mountains, the rivers, the trees, and the birds, the beings that fed them, ancestors who encoded their gratitude and reverence in ritual ceremony and mythic storytelling, and the ways they related respectfully to other beings as relatives. So European descent folk no longer have to poach on native traditions, but can and must do the work of recovering their own indigenous heritage underneath their whitened, already modernized, more immediate ancestors. So there's the story of a young woman, Lila June Johnston, half Diné, half white, who always identified and spent time honoring her native ancestors, but disowning her European side. Until one day, while in a ceremonial house of her native people, a revelation came to her softly from her European grandmothers and grandfathers, and she writes, "They sang to me of their life before the witch trials and before the Crusades. They spoke to me of a time before serfdoms and before Roman tithes. They spoke to me of a time before the plague, before the Medici, before the guillotine, a time before their people were extinguished or enslaved by dark forces. They spoke to me of a time before the English language existed, a time most of us have forgotten. These grandmothers and grandfathers set the ancient medicine of Welsh blue stone upon my aching heart. Their chants danced like the flickering light of Tuscan cave fires. Their joyous laughter echoed on and on like Baltic waves against Scandinavian shores. They blew worlds through my mind like windswept snow over alpine mountain crests. They showed to me the vast and beautiful world of indigenous Europe." This precious world can scarcely be found in any literature, but lives quietly within us like a dream we can't quite remember, unquote. Next slide. So this is what I was referring to earlier when I talked about the modern self. It's actually an outlier, right? The acronym WEIRD, Western, educated, rich, industrialized, rich, democratic, coming out of the discipline of psychology, indicting the way much of the studies in the discipline are based on research conducted on quote unquote weird populations and then mainstreamed as typical. Most of the people on the planet come from sociocentric societies. In fact, all of us, including Europeans, come historically from sociocentric societies with an interdependent view of the self. So the individualism in Eurocentered cultures is really weird when we look at the long view of human history and the planet. In the interdependent view of self, for those of us who come from the Philippines, Latin America, Africa, there is a strong collective identity and the priority of group goals. The importance of interconnectedness is where it shows up. For example, in Filipino psychology, we talk a lot about kapwa, the understanding of the self as shared being, which is anchored in the connected values of loob and damdamin. Loob as an expansive inner self, and damdamin, the capacity for empathy and deep feeling. The difference in the indigenous sense of self is that the self is still embedded in those elements at the bottom: place, myth, ancestors, spirits. These are all alive and all part of who they are. Actually, the middle column, I would say, are those societies that have begun to modernize, but still retain some memory of their indigenous values, right? But the more they move towards industrialization and advancement, the more then they become weird, you know, the more they become individualistic. Next slide. So actually the concept of the I, this masterful self, is only about 200 years old. So it's really new. And autobiographies emerged only in the beginning of the 19th century. And one of the first novels that focused on the individual is Robinson Crusoe. I don't know how many of you read that in high school or college, but it's a kind of a marker of the heroic journey. The individual as a hero, the heroic adventure seeker. And this is also during the time of Western expansion, the age of discovery, the age of enlightenment, etc. So this masterful I, this individualistic I, is fairly new. So what was there before then, before we were transformed into this masterful and autonomous kind of self? Then you have autoethnography with its attempts at self-reflexivity in the manner of telling one's story. And what we're using for this framework is the fourth one, ethno-autobiography, right? The difference between autoethnography and ethno-autobiography is that the latter foregrounds ethnos, the importance of the ground, the history, the place, the indigenous relationships in which the self is embedded, all of the elements that make up the indigenous self. Next slide, please. So there's this story that my sister tells about attending a grief retreat where she was the only person of color, and being struck at the way all the white participants' stories of grief were about the I, the individual story, with the stories not being connected to place, not connected to history, so that the stories became primarily about individual suffering, individual mistakes that they made, personal betrayals, personal crises that they've seen, that they've been through. And she said, wow, I wonder how the stories would change if they could somehow find a way to face all of this grief by seeing it in the larger context of what has been lost as a result of having been modernized, atomized, of having been civilized, right? Because individualism is part of the colonial construction. It's part of the colonial history of the West. It objectifies women, it objectifies bodies, others, and the world. Therefore, you have a discourse of the West and the rest, us versus them, all those shithole countries, as Trump would say. And there's a lot of objectification going on, because if we did not somehow objectify nature, we did not objectify women, if they did not objectify the women that they found when they reached the so-called New World, then how would they have gone about their rapacious imperial adventures without that kind of marking on the other? Next slide, please. So this is our main thesis here. The Eurocentered mind, or white mind, has a habit of forgetting settler histories, the stories of how we came to be where we are. There's the story of the DeWolf family told by one of the descendants, Katrina Brown, of how her family fortune that landed most of its descendants in Ivy League schools and amassing financial wealth and professional success in the process was actually built on slave trading. And she writes, over the generations, the family transported more than 10,000 enslaved Africans across the Middle Passage. They amassed an enormous fortune. By the end of his life, James DeWolf has been a US Senator and was reportedly the second richest man in the United States. Katrina, the DeWolf descendant responsible for uncovering this dark history of the family, vowed never again to countenance silence and covering up and forgetting of such history, inviting some of the family members to trace the routes of the family slave trading through the triangle trade, visiting the DeWolf hometown of Bristol, Rhode Island, slave forts on the coast of Ghana, and the ruins of a family plantation in Cuba. Next slide, please. So one of the authors of a workbook resource I use for laying out all of this is Jürgen Kramer, a German national with a PhD in depth psychology. When he was asked by an indigenous woman, Apila, Colorado, who is of Oneida Gaul ancestry, as they were trying to create a PhD program for indigenous students, who are you, Jürgen? And he didn't have the answer in the way that an indigenous person expects. He realized he had no myths, no stories, no rituals that he could claim as part of his own biography, a lot of them mangled by Hitler and Nazism. But he could say he's a German-trained psychotherapist. I've studied Native American culture. He could say all those things. But in order to answer the question, who are you? To answer from an indigenous understanding, he then had to look at this sense of loss. He had to see what he's been disconnected from, and in the process, managed to explore his Fino, Sami, Ugric ancestry that was back behind his nationalized German European ancestry. And in the book, he talks about both his sense of loss and his journey to recovering some of those losses. You know, he knew how to throat sing at a very young age, and he didn't know where that was coming from. Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with throat singing. It's a particular way of producing diverse voices. I cannot describe it, but it's a skill that he had, and it turns out it was coming from his indigenous ancestry, Fino, Sami, and Ugric. Next slide, please. Again, more on normative dissociation in individualistic societies that produces a modern sense of self that has very thick boundaries, split between inside and outside. A modern Western self with an imperializing and objectifying gaze towards the world, one that likes to think of itself as masterful, that it knows what it wants. That's why we often say, of course you can be whatever you want. You are special. And I think part of this has to do with the self-esteem issue. As the Dalai Lama is said to have commented, he didn't understand why there is such a preoccupation with self-improvement, with self-esteem among Americans. Next slide. So the long body I mentioned earlier from the Haudenosaunee, when somebody asks you, who are you? The answer to that has to include 7 generations before and 7 generations that are to come after you. So they don't make decisions without invoking the wisdom from 7 generations of those that went before, and without considering the impact of those decisions on 7 generations that are still to come. It's beyond the psyche, it's beyond the skin, and it includes other beings. And the past is also part of the long body. Next slide, please. So at some point, we were all cut off from our indigenous roots. What was the resulting trauma? And I'm looking at our time here and wondering whether to do this activity. I think we have time. So I think what I'd like to do is to do a little visualization exercise in regard to this question. And then after we visualize, we can get into groups of 4 or 5, and each can talk for about 90 seconds or 1.5 minutes and share what came up for you during the visualization. And all of that will take about 6 to 7 minutes. And then when you come back, let's have a report from each group summarizing the themes that came up for your group. Is that okay with your permission? Yeah?
Sure.
Okay.
And just Lily, in terms of time, I'm guessing there'll be time at the end for some further reflections and questions that people might have.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So let's get to a place where we can do some visualization. Please close your eyes. If you don't feel comfortable or don't feel safe, you can keep your eyes open. Only do what is comfortable for you. Please take a deep breath and know that you are sharing that breath with other beings where you are. Please take another deep breath. And as you exhale, bring into your awareness a place that is in your family memories. It could be somewhere you live, somewhere you grew up in, where you went to school. Choose a place. It can also be a place that you have heard about in stories, that you have heard talked about in your family. But all you need right now is to visualize that place and or your family who lived recently or generations ago in that place. If you are having trouble concentrating, if your mind is wandering elsewhere, return to the breath. It anchors you in your body. It anchors you in the place where you are. Perhaps you now have a place in your mind's eye. Focus your attention on what family life was or might have been like. There could be memories that you have. You might have some information to go on from family stories, research, or information that could be inferred, suggested by what you imagine what life was like. All that matters is you get some image of life, the people, the time period. Were there children? Was there hardship? Have they moved recently from somewhere else? Were they planning to move elsewhere in the future? Take a few breaths as you bring those images into your full awareness. Now, wherever your attention or consciousness has gone, I'd like you to focus your attention to the natives of that place, the people who were indigenous there before white people settled. Do you know who they are? Did they sign treaties purportedly allowing white settlement? Are there reservations nearby? Does a local school have a native mascot? Are there current native land claims in process? Are any of the place names native in that region? Were there massacres or other atrocities that occurred nearby? Do you know? Did anyone ever talk about the native people? What stories were told? Or were the natives made invisible? Regardless of your answers to these questions, what feelings are you aware of? Whether you know something or know nothing, how does that feel? What does it say about you as a person and about the country in which you live? How does it make you feel about the place you were imagining? What feelings arise between the stories in your awareness? Take a few breaths. Bring those feelings into your full awareness. Take a deep breath as we prepare to come back together to the room. Take another deep breath, knowing that you share that breath with other beings in the place where you are. I will count back from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome back. So when you start sharing in your breakout groups, please allow each person to talk for about 90 seconds. And also there's no need to respond, but just to listen. Can we do that, Mike? So the breakout will probably take about 6 minutes.
We have about 4 people, or I should say 4 screens per breakout room. So we'll have about 6 minutes. And so please keep things moving. Make sure everyone has time to share if they want to. You will need to accept the breakout room that you are assigned to. Okay. See you all in just a few minutes. I'll send a reminder when we're at 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I won't be joining a breakout room.
Okay. All right, let me move Ginny to room 7. Okay.
I'm going to choose to sit tight where I am. I very much had a sense that that exercise were for folks who were very much living in the center, as opposed to folks who are living closer towards the margins. I have a very, very particular experience about when it comes to, again, how you define Indigenous, and particularly given the unique relationship between enslaved Africans and Native people.
Actually, I thought before that the exercise was for the dominant group, right? But
Right.
what happened with me is that in relationship with the tribal people in my home country, that I was a dominant person in regard to that, you know, and it was a shock to me to find out that the whole region where the US base used to be was Aita land. It was tribal land. And my ancestors, who were Malay, straight haired, you know, where when they came, they dissemested. Yeah. So can we hear back from the different groups? What came up?
And this would be just a quick summary from, maybe your experience or something from the group, because we're starting to get close to time and want to make sure we have room for full discussion.
And I can stay over another 10 minutes. I told Jim to hold the fort.
I can speak very quickly for our group, and that is we were able to go back to our grandparents, which would just be a generation and maybe possibly one generation beyond that, nowhere near 7. And then we drew an absolute blank. We didn't know who was on the land of our grandparents before them. So, and we felt curiosity and maybe a desire to answer that question.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mary. Alex?
Yeah, am I on? Yeah. So, yeah, we had a similar discussion of knowing when the towns where we reside started, in terms of settlers taking indigenous lands, but we didn't know the previous history, and we didn't, like when I was growing up, never learned anything about indigenous peoples in Michigan, for example. But then I also told a story about my grandparents from Belarus, which is that's too long to go into right now.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
In our group, we talked about a lot of the people, or the other 3 had memories of grandparents and that age. So talked about traditions there. I've been doing some genealogy recently and have, through some luck, traced my 7th great grandfather back to Salem, Massachusetts. So we were right in the midst of basically taking all of the Massachusetts indigenous people's land away and whitewashing everything with Thanksgiving stories of happy Indians and pilgrims. And that's what I grew up with.
Thanks, Steve. And just a reminder for those who aren't speaking, if you could mute, there's a little bit of background noise that we're getting from different places. So thank you. There's a few more groups. If you could do some quick summary reports.
And if you can speak to the feelings that came up.
I'm speaking just from the 4th group. I think we all felt that we just went back and whatever place we were looking at or thinking of, we really just drew a blank as to the original inhabitants, and we're just thinking about what a shame that was to not know anything and to have such a hard time to be able to picture that land before it had become settled.
Thank you.
Jean and I talked about the names of the streets
Mm.
and the names of lakes and surrounding areas, Arundecoit, Seneca Avenue, Cayuga Street. It speaks to the indigenous people, but that's the knowledge stopping point right there.
Thank you. Thank you. Do we have more? Is that everybody? Mike?
I don't know exactly. Hopefully every group has said something, but I didn't keep careful track of, I don't even know who was in what group. So you're not in the best hands right now.
Well, in our group, and I'm not sure that our group is answered. I wasn't watching the names of the people, but in our group, someone told about his grandfather, and when he had Alzheimer's, he went down and sat on their property by the St. Lawrence River, and he actually had visualizations of the native peoples who came in canoes to the island across from where he was and was welcoming them. So this was in his mind, all coming back or imagining one or the other. And we did all have the same feeling, at least I did, of not knowing who was on the land prior to when, for me, it was my father in Romania when the Germans moved there from southern Germany, not knowing who was on the land in Romania before them. And others reflected that too, that not knowing and wondering, kind of an empty feeling, at least for me. And I heard that, I think, from others. Does someone else want to add to that from our group?
Thank you. I hope we got everybody to share. And I will also admit that that's where I started. And during the breakout, I was in the main room and sharing my own experience of not knowing the indigenous peoples in my home province in Pampanga. I grew up there, and we only saw them in the margins. The missionaries used to take me along with them when they would missionize the Aita people, dark-skinned, kinky-haired, and I was filled with grief when I realized that I lived in the homeland of these people, and I endeavored to know everything I could, and to actually meet them. And at one point, I had a chance to give a plenary talk where they were present, and I couldn't hold back my tears, and I asked for forgiveness, and I said, "You live the way you do, impoverished, racialized, and hardly able to survive because we live the way we do, and the relationship between them and me was so stark." And so when we do this work, we won't put back the PowerPoint just to save on time. We inevitably meet with the need to do what is called shadow work. And we ask the question, is it possible to have deep roots in a place without facing the shadow of conquest, whiteness, colonization, and enslavement? And it's also where we meet with a lot of grief, right? Our indigenous teacher says that war is unmetabolized grief, the refusal to face into the historical and cultural shadows that keeps the unmetabolized grief and trauma multiplying. And when the grief gets solidified and doesn't flow, then the trauma hardens and gets passed down through generations. And we're seeing that today. Look how polarized we are. Yeah. And yet true and genuine grief in an indigenous understanding is also the gateway to healing. And I was wanting to close with 3 thoughts. Indigenous roots can inspire and feed our creativity and presence today. And for example, one principle that I learned from our indigenous teachers, we are not here to get what we want unless what we want is to make beauty that can cause the world to jump up and live again, right? And we each carry the means to overcome individualistically driven crisis responses by accessing and appreciating sources beyond the small selves of our personhood. From this rich and creative well at the roots of who we are, hope and inspiration for the future may arise. Expanding or deepening our sense of self is our hope for the future, our hope for the resolution of our current crisis. And finally, a quote from Arundhati Roy, a South Indian author that I love. The first step towards reimagining a world gone terribly wrong would be to stop the annihilation of those who have a different imagination, an imagination which has an altogether different understanding of what constitutes happiness and fulfillment, who may look like the keepers of our past, but who may really be the guides to our future. And I didn't get to flash the book that actually lays out this framework that I have just presented to you. It's called Ethno-Autobiography, Stories and Practices for Unlearning Whiteness, Decolonization, and Uncovering Ethnicities. And it is indigenously grounded, but it was written by 2 white authors. One is Jürgen Kremer, the German national, and one is R. Jackson Patton, transgender artist who has done work on ecology and indigenous studies as well, who have undergone their own transformation as a result of being tutored by indigenous teachers. So let me stop there. And Mike, you will notice I have a whole lot more slides than we're able to cover, because
Yes.
each one of the elements that we modern humans have disconnected from, those are in the book, are oh, I can flash it to you. Here you go. It's a chapter. It's a chapter in each of the.
Lily, could you read the title off one more time? And then there was a question in the chat that would you repeat the quote about true grief and healing after that?
Okay, so it's Ethno-Autobiography, Stories and Practices for Unlearning Whiteness, Decolonization, Uncovering Ethnicities. And it has beautiful workshop activities that you can do as a community or even in small groups. Jim and I have facilitated this in various contexts with the beloved community here. And it's been really transformative. Yeah.
And how about the quote on healing and grief?
Okay.
Could you repeat that again, please?
Yes, yes. Is it the war as unmetabolized grief, or?
Peggy, which one?
When grief gets solidified and doesn't flow, then the trauma hardens and get passed down through generations. And yet true and genuine grief in an indigenous understanding is also the gateway to healing. Is that it?
That was it. Yes, yes. Thank you.
Right, thanks.
Okay. So,
And
yeah.
Lily, I know you gave a few pieces, and I asked a similar thing to Alex many 4 weeks ago. And this may not even be a fair question, so you can reject it if you'd like. But wondering if you for many of us, this is probably, it feels like a foreign and daunting journey. One we don't have much practice at. And sometimes people want to know how do we even start? And so, we might ask, okay, breathing practices, there may be other pieces of this, but would you have any primary, I know you've worked with Martin Prechtel for quite some time, you've done your own research, your own journey. What might you offer as like beginning steps or even ways to come into this more fully in terms of our own consciousness? I know that the book reference would be one. Any other things you would recommend to people who may not have much familiarity at all?
For me, the book was a gift, because even if I had already been doing my own work and have been on this journey for years, it was still challenging for me to teach predominantly white students in the classroom. One of the courses I teach is multicultural communication, and I used to just walk them from Native genocide, African slavery, and US colonialism, etc. And then they are filled with grief, right? I mean, what do we do? What do we do with all of this? It's like and without having any other ground on which to stand, they would cling on to the whiteness, right? I said, no, they cannot let go of that because they don't have anything else. And so I saw the grief from the losses, right? And I practically spent a sabbatical to shadow one of the authors do this work in the classroom for an entire semester. And it turned around my class. And what is very helpful, if you have the chance to take a look at it, Mike, for example, the first chapter would be, who am I, right? How do you, and it gives you, when from an indigenous understanding, how do you respond to that, right? And when you do the ancestral work, one of the exercises I asked them to do is artifact storytelling. They look for an artifact that's been in their family. One brought a prayer rug. He's a Muslim student. Somebody brought, a souvenir from, and then they tell stories. It's a very gentle process, right, of juggling their memories. All of a sudden, so at the beginning when they do the who am I exercise, the white students would say, I don't have culture, and very short, hardly anything. There are no rituals, there are no ceremonies, they don't remember, right? And then at the end of the class, they say, ask us again, because by then they have done the work, right? They have done the requisite research and talking to their to the oldest in their families, and they even said, all of a sudden family reunions became exciting for us, and they connect. One of them started interviewing her grandmother, and the grandmother shared with her a secret love story that she has never shared with anybody. And it's just amazing, the reconnection with ancestors, right? And then I make them go to a place in nature. And each of these exercises, back behind that, it is all this material that is so helpful. I don't know any other that can do it with a volume like that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just so you all know, Lily needs to also go soon to actually teach, be part of teaching a class. She's
I have a class until 10 o'clock tonight. But we are on break, and Jim is holding the fort. So,
Oh, good, good, good.
I mean, yeah,
Okay.
I can have, yeah.
So you tell us when you need to go, but if there are any sort of, if you can keep questions or reflections brief, I would also maybe ask if Ram, if you might come off, might put your video on just for a minute, because I wanted you and Lily to meet, and knowing full well you two will probably connect at some other point in the future.
Oh, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been great to be able to listen and to your talk tonight. Thank you very much, Lily. I'm Ram.
Me too, Ram.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you all.
Yeah, and Ram, Lily, just so you know, I recommended that Ram connect with you at some point in the future to discuss some of your work and also some of the things he's working on here in Rochester, in how what he's thinking about in terms of graduate education and colonization and decolonization. So, thanks, Ram.
Thank you.
And of course, I you know, the last publication I did it just came out, Decolonizing Eco-Theology, Indigenous and Subaltern Practices. And Ram, we have books, you know, I did one on Back from the Crocodile's Belly, Philippine Indigenous Studies. Yeah.
So much to talk about.
Yeah.
I look forward to it.
I'll connect the two of you. And I also just want to highlight and thank maybe you know, Courtney and I forget who else, Alex. Like we're all approaching this from our own lived historical experiences, our own ancestry, what we know, what we don't know. Not everybody is here or came here under the same circumstances, and so these are really deep and complicated narratives to unpack. That doesn't mean we shouldn't unpack them. That doesn't mean we don't commit to doing the work. So hoping,
Mike, of course there's a lot of pitfalls in doing this work. One is you know, the search for purity, right? That is violent. From the beginning, you look at the model of the earth and nature, it's biodiversity, right? When you begin to do this work, you don't search for purity. And also you can start with fragments. I wish we had time to go through the rest of the slides, but you can probably share those, Mike, because there's something on genealogical imagination, on ancestral research, and beginning to do that work. So.
All right, we'll make those available to, maybe I can send those as a PDF attachment to everyone who's on the email list. And as has happened, this happened with Courtney, it happened with Alex, it happened with everyone who we have spoken with over the past 4 weeks. Each of these sessions could be a day or a weekend or a week or a semester. And so we will try to think about maybe having a part 2, having a part 3 to all of these conversations to help us just have a little more time to go deeper.
And know that what Jim does is to look at the scriptures from an indigenous understanding, right? Looking at the indigenous roots of the Bible. He does that. We do this work together, so he can also be part of it. Yeah.
And I smell a weekend coming up sometime. Any last thoughts? We will release Lily to go and go back to work, another work, and for those who want to stay on for a few minutes, you're certainly welcome to. But any last comments, appreciations?
I guess I didn't realize that, and maybe I didn't read the description of tonight clearly. I just oh, we're doing this on Wednesday. I'm jumping in. I don't care what it is. I want to participate. I want to learn something. I want to contribute. But I didn't know that we were going to focus a good portion of our conversation on the Native American experience. Of course, it was part of my studies as an undergraduate and at Syracuse University, where I had the really great fortune to work with Professor Tom Sullivan, who was teaching Native American studies, and I took a couple of his classes. So I do have some resources that I'd be happy to share with you, Mike, and that you can then distribute. And they're not only books, but they're also videos that we were asked to watch with regard to interviews, and as well as people from the Native community who came in, to speak with the class as well, or classes as well. So I'd be happy to pass those resources on to you as well.
And there's a beautiful documentary of Native and white community reconciliation process. It's called Two Rivers. I'll send the link to you, Mike.
Please do.
It's really so encouraging and heartening, and it's an amazing process of coming together of those two communities.
Great, thanks. Thanks. Yeah, Courtney, you are an amazing wealth of resources, so please send stuff. There's also some amazing film and other local organizing work, specifically around the doctrine of discovery, which some local folks have been part of in upstate. And so I'll send a resource to that. There's a really good film that's out. So there's many ways to begin or continue approaching and unpacking some of what's happening here. And that, if you received the email about tonight, then you will receive the email with all the other stuff that goes with it. If you didn't receive that, then please sign up, register on the website so that you can just get the final email that comes out.
So
again, thank you so much, Lily. We really appreciate you being here with us. Please send love to Jim, and
Thank
yeah,
you.
we'll see you in the future.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
I'll also save the chat and send that out to people as well, because there's some resources in there that that may be useful.
Thank you, Mike.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Good night. Thank you.